All right, thanks. Yeah, I actually am going to be talking about how religion ruins the end of our lives too, on occasion, just in a slightly different way. Just very quickly, Bill, how much time do I have here?
As much as you need. I mean, we typically the talk goes for about an hour.
Okay. All right, cool. I wanted to see how much I should keep in and leave out of what I want to do. It's one of the interesting things about writing a book is that immediately after you write a book because you have something to say that you can't say succinctly, right? You need an entire book to say it. And then immediately people start asking you to summarize it in an article or summarize it in a talk, and that can be very tricky. But yeah, I want to talk about obviously how we wound up here. And I mean that in both the broad and narrow sense. I think it's the same question, right? In the broad sense, how did the United States, a nation with research facilities and scientific expertise and medical infrastructure that is the envy of the world, end up in a position where our coronavirus response was the laughingstock of the world, right? But it's the same question if I ask more narrowly, how did we wind up here? How did I wind up here and you there? It's not so long ago, I gave a talk for the Lehigh Valley Humanists, and we were all in a room. I don't mean to brag, but we were all in the same place. We were breathing the same air, all masklessly. We hugged and whatnot. That seems like a long time ago. And as unpredictable as this circumstance that we're currently in is, if I'm not mistaken, the subject of the talk that I gave back then, at least in broad terms, was, gee, I bet by November of 2020, we're all going to be huddled inside our homes, fearing for our lives, hiding from whatever is outside amidst nationwide civil unrest and a cratering economy. Funny that. The point being is that this is, even though the specifics may not have been predictable, in the broadest sense, this was predictable. We knew this was coming, right? Something like this was coming because we knew that eventually there was going to be a problem that science was going to be the only solution for, and we were going to have this anti-scientific leadership. Now, if the polls are to be believed, we will be rid of Trump before we're rid of the coronavirus. But that being said, we cannot make the mistake of believing that the problems that have hampered our coronavirus response are going to leave with him. This is not a problem that began with him, and it's not a problem that's going to end with him. Right? Let's rewind time. Let's go back to 2016 and imagine that things had gone differently. Let's imagine that Hillary had won. Just imagine that for a second. I know you guys are 501c3. We'll stop imagining that for a second. But had that been the case, I have no doubt in my mind that we still would have had the anti-maskers. We still would have had the plague rats. We still would have had people running around sowing distrust about the vaccines and saying it was all an attempt for Bill Gates to put a microchip in your baby. Right? They wouldn't have been amplified from the White House, no doubt, but they still would have been there. That problem would still exist. And despite that, it's going to be very tempting in a post-Trump America to pretend like that was the entirety of the problem. Obviously the Republicans are going to want to do that, right? The Republicans are going to say, yeah, it was him. He was a bad influence. Secretly behind the scenes, we were trying to help the whole time, but he was hampering our every effort. Now that he's gone, we can all work together. And the Democrats, for the sake of reconciliation, are going to be tempted to play along. They're going to be tempted to say, yeah, you know what? You're right. It was entirely his problem. Now he's gone. Let's hit the reset button. We'll start over at square one and we'll fix everything. This problem is too deadly for us to pretend it's over, right? To pretend it's been solved. It's cost too many lives. And the problem that I'm talking about is the anti-scientific attitude that undergirds the Trump administration's response. That was already there. And if you don't believe me, I invite you to go back and listen to the archives of my podcast, which existed for 4 pre-Trump years, right? And spent the entire time warning of this coming theocracy, warning that this notion of Christian nationalism was getting ever more prevalent, ever more mainstream. Christian nationalism specifically, of course, we're talking about this idea that America was founded as a Christian nation. Yes, and that's false. If you still have any lingering doubts about that, I would direct you to Andrew Seidel's book, The Founding Myth. He does a great job of tearing that down. But it's more than that. It's not just the idea that America is a Christian nation. It's the idea that all of the good fortune and wealth that America has is because it's a Christian nation. Because we love Jesus so much and Jesus loves us back. Apologies, a torrential storm has just opened up over top of me, so I apologize if you guys can hear that. But the point is that they say that the reason America has been so prosperous is because of its Christianity, and you can see how that leads to a ton of different types of xenophobia, right? Obviously, if the key to our prosperity is our Christianity, then the enemy of prosperity is you and I, right? And people of other religions, people of no religions, people of non-Christian religions. So obviously it leads to xenophobia in that sense, but there's another sense, and a very important one as well. If you say that America's prosperity comes from Jesus loving us so much, you're ignoring where America's prosperity comes from. It comes from a lot of places. Sure, it comes from the fact that Americans are hard workers, yada, yada, yada. But a lot of it comes from the fact that we exploited an indigenous people that didn't have our technology or our immune system. A lot of it comes from the fact that we clung to slavery long after most of the world had given up on it. A lot of it comes from the fact that we blatantly and shamelessly profiteered off of world wars that were way over there, right? A lot of it comes from the fact that we've minimized segments of society, that we continue to minimize segments of society, that we have a little empire lit with little colony lits all over the place, that we intervene in democracies when the votes don't go the way we want. Like our prosperity comes from a lot of places, and a lot of those places are pretty dark, right? But to believe that we are prosperous because Jesus loves us so much, you have to ignore all of that. And you can imagine how that creates a ton of problems in a country that has as complicated a racial past as ours, or even as complicated a racial present as ours. Right. So the point being, though, that this is the inevitable result of allowing religion specifically, but anything at all, really, to compete with science in the realm of truth. The arena of truth should be sacrosanct. And yet we let religion play along. And we have to, right? Because if religion is going to claim to be true, you can't get there through science. You certainly can't get to the Christian religion through science. So you have to make exceptions. You have to let somebody else play along. And that's dangerous as hell. As we're seeing, right? As we're seeing, the fact that anything at all can compete, when the scientists come out and the scientists say in one voice, hey, X, nobody should be able to say Y. And yet we have carved an exception out for religion. Now, Americans will tell you they believe in the science, right? Pew Research asks Americans that every year. They go out and they do a survey. They say, how much faith do you have in this institution, et cetera? And consistently, the highest ranking of all the institutions is science, right? Way higher than religion. When Pew asked in 2019, 86% of Americans said they either had a great deal or a fair amount of confidence in scientists. That is a depressingly low number when we're talking about confidence in demonstrable facts, but it was higher than anything else. It was higher than the military, the government, the news, the corporate America, everything else that they asked about, right? 86%. But even that depressing number belies the facts. It exaggerates the numbers because, yes, when you ask people, do you believe in scientists, 86% of them will say yes. But if you change that and you ask, do you believe climate scientists, that number suddenly ticks down. If you ask, do you believe evolutionary biologists, it ticks down even more. And forget the specific sciences. Let's talk about the specific findings of science. Do you believe scientists when they tell you that genetically modified crops are safe? Do you believe scientists when they tell you that vaccines don't cause autism? Do you believe scientists when they tell you that we did, in fact, evolve from filthy monkey men? Right? And suddenly the numbers get lower and lower and lower. Americans don't believe in science. They believe in science selectively. And to believe in selectively is not to believe in at all. They believe in science when it suits them. Hell, even the most anti-scientific positions will tell you they're following the science. Right? The anti-vaxxers, they'll tell you they're following the science. They just know the science better than all them doctors do. And the anti-maskers will tell you they're following the science. They just know the science better than that Anthony Fauci does. And again, this is all the inevitable result of carving exceptions into reality. When you carve into reality, reality bleeds. And eventually reality dies. And that's what we're seeing. That's what a post-truth world is. That's the central argument of my new book, Outbreak, A Crisis of Faith, How Religion Ruined Our Global Pandemic, available now in this lovely paperback version, available soon on Kindle and as an audiobook. The central argument there is that, again, this is not just inevitable. It wasn't just inevitable that this was going to happen when a pandemic broke out, but it's inevitable that it will happen again the next time a problem arises that only science can solve. There's a lot of ways that it does that. Now, I don't have time to go over all of them. Again, needed a whole book for that, but I want to start with incompetent leaders because with the election right on the horizon, it's something that's on everybody's mind. I'm not going to talk specifically about Donald Trump here. I actually want to start with Mike Pence. This is the ostensible head of our coronavirus task force, right? So how the hell does Mike Pence get here? And I don't even mean as the head of our coronavirus task force. I mean as the vice president. Consider this for a second. Normally, when a candidate is choosing a running mate, they choose for one of two reasons, right? Either it's a person that helps them in an area that they need geographically, right? You know, I'm an East Coaster, I need a West Coaster, something like that. Like when Bill Clinton chose Al Gore to help him in Tennessee. Or it's a person that they feel complements a place where they're weak, right? The big knock on Obama was that he didn't have enough experience. And so Obama chose a running mate that had been in Washington forever. The big knock on Biden is that he's an old white guy who's not liberal enough. So he chose a younger, much more liberal woman of color, right? Mike Pence doesn't fit either of those. Mike Pence, first of all, was out of Indiana, the reddest state in the Midwest. If Trump was going to win any states, he was going to win Indiana. What's more, Pence wasn't all that popular in Indiana. If the polls were to be believed, he was on his way to lose re-election as Indiana's governor. He also did, everybody was more experienced than Donald Trump, but he wasn't specific. Like if he was looking for a Washington insider, he hadn't gotten one. So what did Pence offer? Well, the answer to that is the same as the reason why he was on his way to losing re-election in Indiana. This is so much easier when I can edit out the flubs. Mike Pence had proven that he was willing to tank his entire state's economy to stick it to the gays. That was his chief qualification to run alongside Donald Trump. He had proved his evangelical bona fides. And he could offer the same to the Trump administration. I apologize. I live in a town full of trains, so if you hear trains in the background, hopefully the storm will drown them out. So Mike Pence this was not his first foray into homophobia. You'll remember, of course, the Indiana RFRA law that was so overbroad that basically a hotel could refuse to rent a room to a gay couple. A restaurant could kick a couple out for acting gay. There's just an insanely broad interpretation of RFRA, which is already bad, even if you don't make it overbroad. And this led to nationwide boycotts of the state, people pulling out of major companies refusing to do business in Indiana, things like that. And eventually he dialed it back. He rescinded the law that he had expressed support for, but not before again making himself famous as being an anti-gay evangelical warrior. If you had heard of him before, you most likely knew him for his support of gay conversion therapy, also known as torturing the gay out of children, or torturing children until they pretend not to be gay for you. It's an absolutely despicable practice that the American Psychological Association would basically describe in the same terms that I just described it in, right? And Pence rather has supported it throughout his career. He pretends like he never did, which is insane because it's a matter of public record. I talk about this in detail in my book, but if you Google it, you can find records of him vocally supporting not just the concept of conversion therapy, but of federal funding of conversion therapy, and not just federal funding of conversion therapy, but using money that was earmarked for AIDS relief for gay conversion therapy under the argument that it was preventative. That's just so despicable. I felt I needed to pause there for a second. That's who Pence was. And is. And look, when it comes to when he was tapped to be the head of our coronavirus task force, the only qualification that he had, the only thing that he had on his resume that was even remotely related to public health was overseeing one of the most mismanaged HIV/AIDS outbreaks in American history while he was the governor of Indiana. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this. There was an outbreak. This is not something he inherited. It was not just coincidence that he happened to be governor during this. He was directly responsible for it. There was an outbreak that was caught early. Public health officials in Indiana saw it coming. They saw the early warning signs that there was about to be an HIV/AIDS outbreak. They came to Mike Pence and they said, "We need your help. We're about to have a terrible outbreak. It's going to cost a lot of lives." And amongst intravenous drug users. It's already bad. It's already going to be worse than it had to be because your budget cuts shut down the Planned Parenthood in the area, which was the only place that poor people could go to get tested. Right. So we've already made it worse. But now what we need you to do is declare a public health emergency. And the reason for this is that the state of Indiana had a, I don't know if it still does, but had a law against needle exchanges. This is where an intravenous drug user can bring in a used needle and exchange it for a clean needle, no questions asked. These have been proven over and over again to be effective ways to fight the transmission of HIV through intravenous drug users. People who oppose needle exchange programs say it leads to more intravenous drug use. There is no data to support that. They are very effective. Indiana had a law against it. Mike Pence had campaigned for that law. He campaigned for a national law against needle exchange programs, had a big issue with them. So they came to him, they said, "We need you to declare a public health emergency, which will allow us to circumvent this law temporarily." He said no. They came back again later when the problem had gotten worse, and there were actually, people who were getting HIV, widespread instances of HIV. They said, "Please, we just need you to sign this paper, declare a public health emergency." Again, he refused. He prevaricated. Eventually, he finally signed on to it. He finally did what they were asking him to do. But at the same time he did that, he pushed for a law that would make being caught with a hypodermic needle, being caught with drug paraphernalia, a felony instead of a misdemeanor. So he undercut exactly the solution that he had finally agreed to. At its height, there was a county in southern Indiana that had a higher incidence of HIV/AIDS than any country in sub-Saharan Africa under Mike Pence's watch. And this is the only thing on his resume in terms of fighting pandemics. And yet he was tapped as the ostensible head of our coronavirus task force. And why? Because it's not like we had anyone better. Look at who Trump has put in charge of our various scientific departments. Look at the EPA, where he's got Andrew Wheeler, who replaced the astronomically corrupt Scott Pruitt. Andrew Wheeler, whose chief contributions to his department is dissolving the Office of Science Advisor, failing to convene scientific advisory panels that he's required by law to convene, and being the first person to hold that position, well, the second person after his corrupt predecessor to hold the position that is a climate change denier. When asked in his confirmation hearing, he committed only that he, quote, believes that man has an impact on the climate, but what's not completely understood is what that impact is, end quote. So he believes in both climate and change. He was unwilling to commit to anything else. But it gets worse. How about Alex Azar, the Secretary of Health and Human Services? He replaced the astronomically corrupt Tom Price, who you'll remember for spending as many taxpayer dollars on airfare every week that as I make in a year. And of course, Alex Azar, before taking over as the Secretary of Health and Human Services, was best known for raising the price of insulin while he was the CEO of Eli Lilly. Raised the price of insulin because of what are diabetics going to do, right? He's also a stridently anti-abortion activist. Alex Azar spoke at the March for Life rally, which is something that even right-wing politicians generally avoid as being too extreme. At that rally, he declared his, quote, full commitment to protecting the dignity of life from conception to natural death. This guy is charge of the Department of Health and Human Services, which he, by the way, refers to as the Department of Life. I want to actually read you an excerpt from my book here, because this just is disturbing as hell. A little fact about Alex Azar. Among the more alarming legacies that Alex Azar has attempted to carve out for himself in the HHS is his Orwellian rewriting of the departmental lexicon to replace scientific terms with religious ones. Writing for Quartz and relying on data provided by the Sunlight Foundation's Web Integrity Project, journalist Annalisa Morelli analyzed a range of terms on HHS web pages that existed both before and after Trump assumed office, then looked at increases and decreases in word usage. Among the words and phrases that saw the highest increase in usage were faith-based, marriage, and birth control. The ones with the largest decreases were gender, contraception, science-based, and evidence-based. That's the guy in charge of Health and Human Services. One more, because I think he's particularly important. This is Dr. Robert Redfield, the director of the CDC. He replaced the astronomically corrupt Brenda Fitzgerald, who you might remember for having the shortest directorate in the history of the CDC after she was found to be buying tobacco stock immediately after taking over the position. Dr. Redfield is more qualified than most in the Trump administration. He is a doctor, which would be seen as a prerequisite by any other president. But in his instance, it's like I said, in Trump's administration, it's a welcome relief. He was actually even considered to be the director of the CDC once before under George H.W. Bush, but ultimately he was rejected because he had an excessively controversial history in terms of AIDS. He was among the chief architects of the Army's response to the original HIV/AIDS outbreak in the 80s. If you're familiar with that at all, it was a cruel stain on America's history. It was absolutely despicable. It followed the entire Reagan administration's response on AIDS. It was similar in its despicable homophobia and homicidal negligence, and that by itself should be plenty to disqualify anybody for leadership of any major institution from that point on. But there's a lot more working against Robert Redfield. He was also in charge of the research of a thing called Vaccine, which was touted as a potential vaccine for AIDS. It wasn't an actual vaccine, but many people believed that it could act very much like a vaccine. Among the believers was Redfield, who continued to believe it long after the scientific data would suggest otherwise, long after any reasonable researcher should have concluded that it was hopeless. Even after that, Redfield continued to push for funding. He continued to push for human trials over and over and over again. Often he got them because he had political connections, and he used those when the scientific connections wouldn't work. He would pull out his political connections. So he wasted an enormous amount of time and money on that. But again, there's more with this guy. The reason why Trump ultimately chose him is because, again, he's got the religious bona fides. He is stridently anti-condom. Has been for his entire career. He's been researching AIDS since the 80s, and he's always been against condoms. He prefers abstinence as our first line of defense, and says that it's immoral to use condoms, to give out condoms and promote promiscuous sex. Or at least he used to. He changed his mind. He did change his mind, even after writing the foreword to a book about how terrible it is to give condoms to people who are in danger of getting AIDS. Even after that, he did change his mind ultimately right before he was nominated to run the CDC. Funny that. But it's not, this problem doesn't only exist in the executive branch, right? I've been focused on Trump appointees, but the whole point here is that this problem is going to outlive Trump. Now, my book opens up with a preface by my friend and colleague, Andrew Torres. If you're not familiar with his work, I would strongly urge you to check him out. He is the co-host of the Opening Arguments podcast. He's a Harvard-educated lawyer. He's an absolutely brilliant guy, but he's also very talented at breaking down legal matters in a way that the layman can understand. That's what he does over on his show, Opening Arguments, and that's what he does in the book. He sort of lays out the legal landscape that all of this is playing out in. And I can't do it as well as he can, but I do want to highlight two recent Supreme Court decisions that I think are very important, and have a lot more effect on our COVID response than people realize. The first is the Masterpiece Cake Shop decision. You remember this was Jack Phillips versus Colorado Civil Rights Commission. I believe I have that right. Anyway, the gist here is that a same-sex couple wanted a wedding cake in Colorado. They go into the Masterpiece Cake Shop. The guy says, no, I don't serve gay people. They're like, well, then just give us a cake and we'll write our own names on it. He says, no, I'm not going to give you that either. So they go to the Civil Rights, the Civil Rights Commission. They say, hey, our civil rights were violated. The Civil Rights Commission said, yep, they sure were. And they fine this guy. He appeals it, winds up in front of the Supreme Court. And ultimately, the Supreme Court finds for him. They find for Jack Phillips. They say, hey, they don't actually find that he had any right to refuse service to this couple now. What they find instead was that when the Colorado Civil Rights Commission looked into the case, they did not provide, and I quote, neutral and respectful consideration, end quote, of Jack Phillips' beliefs. So what does that mean from a legal perspective? Neutral and respectful consideration. This is a legal decision. Obviously, you want to define your terms very specifically. Oh, wait, no, you don't. Kennedy made that phrase up. It had never appeared in any Supreme Court decision before. It's completely undefined in American jurisprudence. It means whatever the hell the next judge thinks it means. We have no definition. We know that the Colorado the Civil Rights Commission didn't obtain it, and it's real hard to find anything that they did that was disrespectful or not neutral, if you look back over at the facts of the case. So we know you got to be damn neutral and damn respectful, but we don't know how to determine if someone has done so. Right. So that's one very important decision. And again, this is pre-Trump. So it's a quick reminder that is not the root of the problem. The other one was also pre-Trump. It was the Trinity Lutheran decision. Now, this one, you'll recall, I believe it was in the state of Missouri. State of Missouri says we have enough money to refurbish a dozen playgrounds. Instead of the concrete that it was under the monkey bars when you and I played on them as kids, they wanted to put those shredded up tires that are much safer under them. They said, we've got enough money to do a few of them. It's a limited thing. If you want to apply, go ahead. If you've got a playground, go ahead and apply, unless you're a church. And Trinity Lutheran Church came and they said, well, why unless you're a church? They said, well, because of have you not heard of the First Amendment? Are you not familiar with America, the thing we were doing? And they said, First Amendment, we want that money. And they sued. And it wound up in front of the Supreme Court. And once again, the Supreme Court got it wrong and decided that Trinity Lutheran had every right to that state money, to those limited funds. And the way that they got there was kind of insane. They said that yes, you can't give federal money to a church. Obviously, the First Amendment forbids that. But the playground is a secular part of the church. Because you see, if you don't have to be, they don't check as you're going into the playground to make sure that you're Christian. Obviously, every kid in the neighborhood plays with on the playground. They don't use that part for proselytization. It's not like you're using federal money to buy Bibles and pews. You're just using it to refurbish this playground, so that counts. Well, people said at the time, oh, it's a very narrow decision. Well, no, it's not. It's only as narrow as the interpretation of the decision by the next person making a decision. Right. So when later on, when a hurricane hits Texas and FEMA comes in and says, hey, we're gonna rebuild, but of course we're not going to rebuild churches. The churches said, why not? They said, well, the First Amendment. They said, well, no, we're not doing the First Amendment anymore. The Supreme Court said Trinity Lutheran doesn't count. They said, no, you're asking us to rebuild Bibles or to buy Bibles and to buy pews for you. They said specifically in that decision, we don't have to do that. So the churches sued. They sued FEMA. The first judge that saw the case said, no, that's clearly not what Trinity Lutheran said, threw the case out. That didn't matter. Donald Trump chimed in. Donald Trump tweeted out, he said, I think that they should give the churches. Well, he's a legal scholar, so he probably knows better than this judge. And so FEMA changed their minds. They changed the policy. They changed the policy to stand in defiance of the First Amendment. They actually used federal tax dollars to buy pews and Bibles. And they used Trinity Lutheran to justify it, even though a judge had already looked at that case and said, no, Trinity Lutheran doesn't apply here. So this is the backdrop, judicially, legally. Obviously, we could go into a lot more detail here, but just in broad strokes. Let's say you're a governor. Let's say that there's a terrible pandemic that's threatening the lives of the citizens of your state. And you have to issue orders as to what to do. And let's say the federal government is not giving you a whole hell of a lot of direction as to how to do so. What do you do about religion? How do you ensure that you've been sufficiently neutral and respectful to religion? Sufficient for your orders to actually stick. Now, look, are churches essential? Well, I think, the Lehigh Valley humanists would probably agree that they're not. But Christians probably would say that they are. Well, couldn't you just do your sermons online? Obviously, we've managed to do our stuff online. But hey, you can't baptize somebody on a Zoom call. Right? You can't do the laying on of hands on Skype. You can't text somebody a communion wafer. Right? So religious people might say, no, we have to meet in person. And as a governor, you've got to say to yourself, well, hey, no law has ever been struck down for being too neutral and respectful. I've got to err on that side. So you end up, issuing these very carefully worded and exempted orders. Ultimately, 40 of 50 states, when they issued their orders, carved out some type of exemption for churches. 40 of 50. 15 of them let churches continue to meet without restriction throughout the pandemic. And no surprise, study after study found that churches were reliable super spreaders. Of course, even where there were restrictions, the pastors, the churches still defied them. If they were very Gavin Newsom, one of the few governors that actually restricted churches the way that you'd want, right? Like along with all the other groups, in the same way that they would restrict the Lehigh Valley humanists. Gavin Newsom was sued by a trio of churches for violating their First Amendment right to assembly, to religious assembly. He wasn't the only one. Governor of Colorado was sued. The governor of Kansas was sued. One of my favorite suits came out of New Mexico. Governor of New Mexico was sued. They restricted gatherings to 10 people or fewer. There was a mega church in Albuquerque that sued them. They said, no, we can't do that. We can't do it with just 10 people. We have to have a larger group. They're like, well, you already broadcast your services online, though. You don't even have to buy a new webcam. You guys are already doing that. They said, yes. We already do that. But we need more than 10 people to broadcast our services. Like how so? The pastor, one Steve Smotherman, explained that in his lawsuit that they need a worship staff of 12 to 14 people and a technical staff of 16 to broadcast their sermon or their service online. Keep in mind that through the first wave of the pandemic, like Saturday Night Live and The Tonight Show and The Daily Show, they all managed to do that with 10 or fewer people in the room together. But that was too much to ask of a megachurch in Albuquerque. So slightly worse offender here. You might remember Rodney Howard Brown in Tampa, Florida. During the first wave of the pandemic, Florida was very hesitant to issue any type of restrictions whatsoever. Ron DeSantis was one of the last governors to issue a lockdown order. I know because I live right next to Florida. And so many of the cities in Florida had to get there before him. So Tampa was one of them. Tampa issued a lockdown order that included churches, restricted gatherings to 10 or fewer people. Rodney Howard Brown was having none of it. He said not only could he continue to meet, but he could continue to do so safely. I want to read you his quote because it's amazing. He said, quote, "The Lord has helped us to secure our congregation We bought in 13 machines, sick, that basically kill every virus in the place. If somebody walks in the door, it's like it kills everything on them. Continuing, if they sneeze, it shoots it down at like 100 miles an hour. It'll neutralize it in split seconds. So we have the most sterile building in, I don't know, all of America. Suffice to say, the only true part of that statement is I don't know. There were no laser-guided virus drones flying around shooting at people's sneezes in his church. Investigators did check on it. But Howard Brown, with that excuse, he continued to meet. He continued to bring hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people together week after week in his church, all singing and shouting and amening together, no masks, no social distancing. The city told him to stop it. He didn't. The city issued a warrant for his arrest, and he said, oh, goody. Right? He gleefully went down and turned himself in and got himself a nice little mug shot and some finger paint, because that's all that happened to him. He's, at the same time that the courts are sending the message to governors that say, hey, religion, laws doesn't apply to religion. They're sending the same message to religious leaders. He knew good and damn well that he was never going to face any punishment. He knew good and well that charges were going to be dropped against him, that if anything, he was going to pay a tiny, tiny little fine. And in the meantime, he gets to be a martyr. He gets to be arrested for Jesus. He gets to walk in there and pretend like he's been persecuted. And pretend like he doesn't care about the consequences. He's going to preach for the word of Jesus. Damn the consequences. And I emphasize that because about a week after the arrest, he actually faced real consequences. His insurance company came and said, hey, man, we're going to cancel your insurance if you don't stop doing this. And he's like, oh, I'm very, very sorry. I'll stop doing it. So when the real consequences came, he backed off. Ultimately, I should say, by the way, that when Ron DeSantis did issue his statewide lockdown orders, he rescinded the citywide orders and exempted churches. So ultimately, Rodney Howard Brown was allowed to meet. One more that I want to highlight, and he might have been the most egregious example, at least during the first wave of the pandemic. That was Tony Spell in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. You might remember this guy. Unlike Florida, Louisiana was a COVID red zone at the time. Right. Obviously, New York and California are sort of the ports of entry in America. So they were the first two places to get it really, really bad. But the first wave happened right around Mardi Gras. And so Louisiana was another very, very dangerous place in the early goings of the pandemic. It was had the third highest per incidence rate of COVID early on. And that did not impress Tony Spell. The governor there issued a statewide lockdown, said gatherings, and like all of these governors, they increased it, right? They said no gatherings above 50 people. Oh God, that's not enough. 25 people. Oh God, that's not enough. 10 people, right? And Tony Spell told them they could go to hell. He continued to bring people in to his church by the hundreds, by his count by the thousands, right? There is at least some evidence that maybe he was exaggerating his numbers a bit, but at least hundreds of people were gathering together over and over again throughout the crisis in his church. He was bussing them in. He would send out buses to go get more people so that we could spread it out to as many rural parts of the state as possible. Over and over again, he did this. The police chief in the area tried to hold him responsible. They tried to do something, but again, you can't make a law apply to religion. Watching his press release when he announced that he was going to try to do something, you just felt sorry for the guy. He trots out a bunch of other pastors and priests that agree with him and say, yes, you can do your religious services, but you got to do them online. They're not persecuting Christians. It's just this one guy who's being an asshole that they're trying to deal with. Right. I want to read you a quote from Police Chief Roger Corcoran talking about Tony Spell. He said, quote, instead of showing the strength and resilience of our community during this difficult time, Mr. Spell has chosen to embarrass us for his own self-promotion. He will have his day in court where he will be held responsible for his reckless and irresponsible decision that endangered the health of his congregation and our community, end quote. Needless to say, the part about him embarrassing everyone for his own self-promotion turned out to be far truer than the part about him having a day in court where he was held responsible for his reckless irresponsibility. This was absolutely all about self-promotion, all about pretending to be a martyr. And if you need any more evidence of that, I'll point out that at one point in the proceedings, he hired Roy Moore to defend him. Roy Moore, the Alabama Supreme Court Chief Justice that was twice removed for ethics violations, who later became a failed Senate candidate, who was credibly accused of child molestation. That Roy Moore? Yeah, that Roy Moore. So he hired that guy to defend him. Now, eventually he was arrested, but not for violating these state lockdown orders. After weeks of this defiance, there started to be protesters at his church, people that would gather together and say, please stop endangering the lives of our communities. And he was arrested for allegedly backing his bus threateningly towards a few of those protesters. That's how he eventually got arrested. I don't know whatever came of that. Look, the point is that there are ample examples of exactly this. I filled a book with them, right? And it's not, we've touched on a few of the ways that religion has exacerbated this problem. It's allowed the qualifications for leadership to be perverted by saying that something can be more important than competence. Right? Agreeing with me, hating the right people can be more important than knowing what you're doing. It's led to these uneven and senseless orders that constantly exempt religious institutions and religious leaders for no damn reason from policies that are meant to protect all of us. And of course, even when it doesn't, these religious people know that they're above the law. These religious leaders know that they're above the law and just defy it. Now, I know that there are an awful lot of churches that did the right thing. An awful lot of churches shut down well before anybody told them to do it. But the fact that some people did it right is not going, you can't go to the doctor and say, no, I don't have coronavirus. Most of the people that I encountered did it right. Most of the people did the job, did the right thing. It only takes one of them doing it wrong to take out a whole community. But there are plenty of other ways that religion and religious thinking and religious leaders exacerbated this problem. America's religious leaders have also been wanton fonts of misinformation throughout. They have echoed the claims that the threat is overblown or that it's a democratic hoax or that you're immune to it if you love Jesus enough. You hear an awful lot of that. My God is more powerful than any virus. I have a list in my book, an extensive list of prominent voices in the Christian community that have promoted quack cures or that have denigrated potentially life-saving cures. How many of them have said, oh, that vaccine, don't take it when the vaccine comes out because it's going to be of the devil. It's going to have aborted babies in it. It's going to be used to usher in the end times. And again, I'd love to say this is only coming from the extremists. I mean, it is by definition, right? These are extreme views, but we have mainstream extremists now. These are ideas that are being entertained at the highest levels of government. The idea that the vaccine might be of the devil. Do you honestly think Mike Pence is able to look at a notion like that and go, well, that's obviously false? What gives you that impression? Look, the key, again, if you take nothing away from this talk, except one sentence, let it be that these problems will not go away with the changing of the presidential guard. They will exist and they will continue to hamper America's pandemic response and under a Biden administration as well. And in a world increasingly reliant on scientific literacy to solve its most pressing problems, they will await the next crisis too. So thank you. That is everything that I had there. It took a lot longer when I set it out just to myself sitting in a room, but I did leave some time for questions there as well. So Bill, I'd like to hand it back to you. And I don't know what you guys normally do and how you normally handle a question and answer period.
It's very chaotic. People just shout stuff out. So anyone questions?
I'll start the chaos. Great. Thanks for the presentation. Look forward to reading the book. So the one thing, and again, I read actually recently Andrew Seidel's book that you cited as well. And the thing that I often find a little bit missing. I mean, yes, it's great to point out all these facts, and it's a place to start. What really feels frustrating is no real path forward that's obvious. What would you recommend as activist kind of actions from our side to kind of make some gains against these, religious kind of, problems with our country?
Yeah, that's certainly the $64,000 question, right? Like, and I think that the solution, at least as far as I see it, is just to be a more reliable voting bloc. If you think about it, people who are religiously unaffiliated, I believe are the largest religious group in the country. Now, we can't ask the nuns is too broad. That's too broad of a category for us to mobilize. But just the humanists and the atheists and just the those of us who belong to humanist and atheist groups as a voting bloc are large enough to actually get shit done. So the problem, in my opinion, more than anything, is that we continue to coddle religion so blatantly throughout the country, throughout our government, that we continue to give them a seat at the table at all. I think there just needs to be a more organized voice that stands up every time religion is given an exemption and says no. They've gone to these great lengths to try to redefine the notion of religious persecution to the point where I can persecute them by doing something to someone else, right, consensually. And there's just not enough of a voice, in my opinion, speaking in the other direction. I mean, obviously, I think there's not enough of a voice doing that, or I wouldn't have dedicated my career to doing so. But I think, just simply voting, focusing more of our efforts on ballot initiatives and on reinforcing the importance of the humanists for Biden. I don't know if you're familiar with this group. I believe that's the terminology. Anyway, it's one of the first groups that's come out and specifically said, like, hey, donate money to us, and we will. We're going to pump money into races where humanists are running for Congress. You can donate to our group, and we're going to find the best humanists to give this money to, the people who are willing to join the Free Thought Coalition once they join Congress. And so I think that the activities of these groups are the closest thing that we have to a solution. Do we have any other questions, or
Yeah, I have one. Isn't it also observable that a lot of the anti-science opinion in the American people isn't necessarily religious based, but is based on this American exceptionalism or rugged American individualism, like, hey, don't you, Governor Wolf, try to take away my rights, rather than don't you, Governor Wolf, try to take away my religious rights. It's just my rights because I'm an American. Yeah.
Well, I think there's a blurring of the line between that nationalism and religion, of course, that's sort of encompassed in the Christian nationalism idea. But the reason I focus so much on religion is because I think that's the in that unreality has into our conversation, right? So if it's just this question of my rights and everything, we can all agree on a logical means of arriving at an answer of what does and doesn't count as my rights, et cetera, et cetera. But religion forces us to make exceptions to basic logic in a way that very few other things do. And so I think that religion, in a lot of ways, keeps the door open for these other types of irrationality that you're talking about.
Oh, and by the way, the stained glass window behind me is not from a church. It's the peace window from the United Nations.
Oh, nice.
Just saying. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I read somewhere, and I don't know where, so that's why I'm not sure it's true, but that Pence is part of a religious movement that is dedicated to getting people with his extreme religious views into political office. And as part of that, he was holding prayer meetings in the White House and all this sort of stuff. Do you know anything about that, or is that somebody's wacky conspiracy theory?
Well, I don't doubt for a second that Pence is involved in an organization like that. I'm not aware specifically of Pence's involvement. I wouldn't be surprised at all if he was involved in Project Blitz, which is a very vocal, very public organization that's doing exactly that, and not just trying to get religious extremists into office, but also trying to promote this Christian nationalist version of American history in elementary and high schools, they've got a series of insidious goals. It wouldn't surprise me at all to find out that Pence was involved in that. But there are a number of groups like that are very openly trying to do exactly what you're saying. So,
Okay.
Well, I want to just mention, well, thank you, Noah. I appreciate you coming and doing this. Our own, not mine, but the Congresswoman who represents the Lehigh Valley, Susan Wild, is a member of the Free Thought Coalition, Free Thought Caucus. So
awesome.
that might be mentioned as far as making donations or the way people vote. We should mention that.
Yeah, no, I know. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
All I said was wow.
Oh, okay. Yeah. No, I know that as a 501c3 that there are restrictions on what Lehigh Valley Humanists can suggest in terms of voting. But yeah, I think it's very important that those of us who have the ability to support candidates, that we look at that. I donate to candidates in the Free Thought Caucus, regardless of geography. So. All right. Do we have any other questions or? All right. Well, I'll tell you what, I really want to thank you guys for the time. The name of the book is Outbreak, Crisis of Faith, How Religion Ruined Our Global Pandemic. You can also check me out on the Scathing Atheist or God Awful Movies, where we break down a bunch of old, terrible religious movies and talk about not only how bad they are in terms of production quality, but how bad they are in terms of the messages that they send. So I'd love to see you guys along for some of that.
Thank you so much, Noah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Have a great day.